Hi, I'm Kenny.
And I'm Monica.
And you're listening to Questioning Faith,
A podcast where we discuss our journey with the Christian faith.
In today's episode on marriage, we discuss some of the things we used to believe about marriage in our fundamentalist Christian faith, and then what we think about that now.
Right. We get asked a lot about marriage because we were so strongly committed to the Christian faith and our marriage was all about serving Christ. And so it's interesting reflecting back on what we used to feel about it.
So this is just kind of touching the tip of the iceberg of what marriage is in Christianity and just kind of talking a little bit about it. We might visit this again to talk a little bit more in depth about it.
Let us know what you think about our discussion on marriage.
So today we're going to talk about marriage, specifically the very conservative evangelical Christian view of marriage that we took part in and the view of marriage that we set our vows under.
Right. We felt it holy and we were really committed to this idea of serving God through our marriage. And now we definitely view all of it differently.
In fact, what we would say about this view of marriage is that while there are plenty of people who are happy in their marriages, and we were most certainly happy in our marriage,
right,
these teachings about marriage are misogynistic. They're arrogant in their view in the way that they treat other marriages outside of Christianity.
Right, and they have a tendency to enable abusers.
So I guess let's kind of go through that.
And why we feel like that is true, like how we could have radically changed from wholeheartedly feeling like this was good and this was serving God and it was healthy to just the complete opposite. We now feel it's a very unhealthy view of the world and of marriage. I guess it starts with how we were taught about what marriage means.
Yeah, that marriage is 100% about glorifying Jesus, about making the name of Jesus, the name of God, look good.
Right.
And that's what marriage is really about.
Showing Jesus and his relationship to the church.
Let's talk about that first aspect that I mentioned, that I think it's misogynistic. When you hear, or at least when I hear that phrase of, marriage is supposed to glorify Jesus, that sounds like it's supposed to be a good thing.
Right.
And that it's supposed to be healthy, and there's a perception that it's supposed to be filled with joy and love and all these things, and most certainly that is the idea, right?
Right.
But why do we now see it as being misogynistic?
I suppose it's because the nature of the whole thing is that it's supposed to represent Jesus and his church, and that's the biblical view of it. And so the whole premise is that the woman is the church and the man is Jesus. So from the get-go, you have the guy in a position of power and the woman in a position of submission. Yeah. Like Jesus is God, so he has all power over you and all control, and the church is supposed to submit and serve and worship him irregardless of what he does.
Which isn't entirely what we believed. That's not the way we presented it. This is Ephesians 5, right? Which gets into that. Wives, submit to your husbands as the church submits to Christ.
Right.
And then husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church.
Mm-hmm.
There's, at least the way I have taught it before, is that loving...
There's supposed to be reciprocity in that it's the man serving the woman and the woman serving the man. Or that was our interpretation within our church of what that text was meaning.
Right. At least that's the way we softened it, I think.
Right.
Because I think you're right. There is most certainly a power imbalance already embedded in that. If the man represents Jesus, God, that's where the power sits. And most certainly that's what we see throughout the Bible.
For sure. And even if you do believe it was supposed to be mutual in serving each other, there's still an inherent, Jesus is God, so he does have the power. If he wants to put his foot down, then he can at any time. He's the one with the authority.
Right.
There's always that fact there, that one entity is more powerful than the other.
Right. It goes even further into that when you consider other places in the Bible that talk about the roles of men and women.
Right.
Like if we go back to Genesis, in Genesis 2, when God looks at man, his creation, and sees that there's something missing, God decides to provide man a helper.
Right.
And the
divine helper or whatever that wording is.
The Hebrew word for it is not just like, an assistant. It's help that comes from God.
Right.
And so it's still something that is there for the sake of the man.
Yeah, for the service of the man, for the sake of the man.
Right.
Not for their own value.
Yeah.
And we certainly see misogyny throughout the text from beginning to end of like Old Testament, women can be stoned for not being a virgin. You never see those kind of commandments for men. All the way through to the New Testament where you have Paul or whoever wrote, 1st and 2nd Timothy, that women should be silent in the church. Just all the way through, you see nuggets of male oppression
against women.
Against women.
Yeah. Well, and even within the Old Testament law, men are worth more than women. Under, as far as like tithing goes, when a woman gives birth, there's a certain period of uncleanness that she has to go through where she is unclean. It is different for male and female children. If she has a female child, it's like 60 days. If it's a male child, it's only 30 days.
Right. Yeah. And they're not as dirty.
Right. There's just all of this which I think is completely understandable for this ancient set of rules.
Trying to make sense of the world. They understand, like, juices just came out of this woman. Like, it's a rough process. There's probably sickness involved. Yeah. Probably really good for bacteria and germs to be isolated. So they probably, I'm speculating, but notice that women and babies maybe survived better away.
Right.
So it all evolves out of things like that, and then it's recorded
in a culture that most certainly was a male-dominated culture.
Right.
And so, of course, it's going to be misogynistic.
Right.
The issue that I have with it, and I think that we have with it, is that we were part of a faith system. We were part of this evangelical Christianity that wanted to hearken back to that.
Right.
It was, we want to get back to the original, this is the things that we would say all the time.
Get back to the original text.
Got to get back to the original text, what the original meaning was. And, well, the original text and the original meaning
are horrific.
Yeah. So why would we want to do that?
Right. Within marriage, though, the misogyny is extra prevalent. Not even just Christian culture, but the Bible as well. We've been a part of many churches, and we've seen many Christian marriages played out, and it's always really in the air, that misogyny.
I've had pastors, I think this is common, pastors who will praise their wives from the pulpit, which there's tons of influence that comes from that pulpit, right?
Right.
The fact that you're saying it up there is going to make people believe it, agree with it, and want to emulate it.
Yeah, because you're having some sort of authority when you speak from that position.
Right. And so we'd have pastors who would say things like praising their wives for being submissive, for not disagreeing with them on whatever they've decided.
They never argue with me. I bring up a new point. They just agree.
They don't think about it. They don't go through this process of contesting it.
Right.
The ideal wife that is portrayed is one who is quiet, one who listens, one who absorbs, not one who has her own opinions and a desire to express them.
Right. Certainly not one who argues back just to contend the truth of a point. Just constant praise and admiration for the woman who just accepts what her husband says without disagreement.
Yeah.
And there was also that Bible passage in the Psalms that said something akin to, it is better for a man to live on the roof in the rain than inside of his house with a nagging wife.
Yeah, it's in Proverbs.
Proverbs.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's been a long time, so that's funny. I mixed those up. Proverbs. Okay, it's something like that, though.
Yeah, it's better for a man to sit on like the corner of the roof of his house or something like that than to have to put up with a nagging wife or whatever.
Right, but that was one that was discussed in women's group in various churches with various people. You know, like, you don't want to be construed as nagging. Like, that's the ultimate, like, you are doing a bad job as a wife if you're a nagging wife. So, like, you say you ask for something, and then if it doesn't happen, and we see this echoed like in John Piper's work, like a lot of prominent, obviously male pastors and leaders saying things like, well, maybe it's best for you to just let it go than to be dishonoring to God. Or maybe it's better for you to just do it yourself than to dishonor your husband and then therefore be in sin with Jesus. It's just this constant, you can't demand what you deserve and you can't act a certain way if you want to have a godly marriage, even if that means you're being wronged or you're being hurt. Even not physically, just even mentally or worn out.
Right. It all goes back to that. Is your marriage honoring Jesus?
Right.
And the way to honor Jesus is to set up the man as the head of the family.
And the church, the woman as the servant or as the helper.
Yeah, over and over again.
Right.
And that's what leads to the next point, is how I think that opens the door for a lot of abusive relationships.
Right. And I think that abusers are going to abuse in a lot of ways, irregardless of their religion or their belief system. But I think what the evangelical church does for those type of people is gives them an excuse to do it and a way to hide.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's not creating abusers.
Right. It's just hiding them or giving them an outlet and an excuse to continue abusing. Whereas if that wasn't an option, we'd have to call these people out and actually call them bad people.
I remember on multiple occasions having conversations with as a pastor or just as a person who's discussing it with pastors or with people about what should a woman do who's in an abusive marriage. Mm-hmm. Because another thing that is prevalent in the evangelical Christian church is that divorce is out of the question.
Right,
You
because,
can't get divorced.
that completely breaks the imagery of the church submitting to Christ and Christ holding on to the church. So it's a sin.
Right, because the idea is Jesus isn't going to leave us.
Right.
As damaged, that guilt culture, as damaged as we are, as awful as we might be to him, he's not going to leave us.
Right, and the church can't leave Jesus. Like, once saved, always saved.
Right.
So it completely...
If you do leave, then you were never together to begin with.
It wasn't real faith.
Right.
And so, yes, leaving is the ultimate sin, or leaving is at least a really big sin against God and against this imagery. So I've seen it and heard it just over and over as a female in the church, that it's better to endure the abuse, seek help from the church through it, those kinds of things. To mention John Piper again, that's one of his things that he has been quoted saying many times, is sometimes a woman just has to endure for a period. But what's interesting to me in that is that the imagery of what most Christians believe to be true about God, Jesus, and the church being a unified picture is that by the male abusing the woman, they've already broken the picture. The love is already not there. It's already not real. It's already damaged. It's the woman leaving that's even worse,
Right.
In a lot of denominations, not all of them. There's a lot of more liberal denominations, and so we're not speaking about all of them, but the more fundamental, Bible is absolutely true, word for word, you have to adhere to it. We're looking at a situation where that imagery has already been broken, yet it's still worse for the woman to leave that situation, because then it's airing your dirty laundry in public.
And if your marriage looks bad in public, then your marriage is not representing the gospel to people.
That's a party line that you hear over and over. Like, the goal is that your marriage shows Jesus so that people look at your marriage, see how great it is, and want to be a part of it. And it's supposed to be a way of evangelizing. Like, you're supposed to have such a great marriage, supposed to be on display so that other people see it, think it's great, and want to join. Like a cult.
Right, yeah. Yeah. That's how our wedding was.
Absolutely. That was our whole goal, was to show Jesus. And
that's what we told our pastor who married us. We said, whatever you do with the ceremony, whatever you say, just preach the gospel. That's all we want.
We want anyone who is shaky in their faith to be renewed. We want anybody who's not a believer to see how great and wonderful Jesus is through us, and therefore proclaim Christ. It was all about that outreach to evangelize. And so if you're airing your dirty laundry, then you're undermining that process. You're not recruiting people to your cause. And so it just further undermines the gospel, and you're in further sin.
Right.
Really, that part, even if not biblically, maybe biblically, but at least within the culture, that was worse than even being an abuser, was failing to show people Jesus.
Right. The first part of 1 Peter 3 is talking about marriage and the roles of marriage. And listen to how long the instructions are for the woman, and then how long they are for the husband.
Nice. All right. I like this challenge.
Likewise, wives, be subject to your husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and putting on of gold jewelry and the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Right? So submit to your husbands, and hopefully in your silence, even if they are unbelievers or even if they are doing something wrong, they'll see your submissiveness and it'll turn their heart. On top of that, make sure that you're conducting yourselves correctly. Don't put your hair in braids. Don't wear a bunch of jewelry. Don't wear, too fine clothing. You don't want to adorn your outward beauty. Instead, seek that inward beauty, which again goes back to that submissiveness, right? The imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, looking to Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him Lord, right? So it goes through all of that for women. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. That's it. And still, even in the instructions to the husband, goes back to the weakness of the wife.
Right.
The weaker vessel. So it's just this constant degrading of women.
Treating women like property. I mean, it's the classic 2,000 years ago how men treated women. Nothing extra moral about it that you would get from some sort of divine good being that transcends time. It's just the culture of the day. The men are in charge. They're putting it in text to further solidify their power.
Yeah. And so hanging on to that is hanging on to that misogyny, and most certainly is what I think leads to enabling abusive relationships.
Right.
Not necessarily creating them, but definitely enabling them.
Right.
And, that kind of view, honestly, makes it unsurprising for me to see all of these prominent men in Christianity being found out to be philanderers, being exposed as people having inappropriate relationships.
Right.
Not because
they've tucked themselves away in Christianity to hide what they already wanted to do, and then exploited kind of the tenets of Christianity to still seek honor, still be praised for their position, and still get what they want.
Right.
Within that, too, there's pressure on the woman to stay in the marriage because you don't want to break that imagery of Christ and church. So when they're being abused, even if the husband is not a Christian, or if it is just some Christian who believes they have the right to be an abuser because of their faith, whatever the situation, the woman is less likely to leave if she's a believer because she doesn't want to be in sin with God. And so there's this trap that is twofold. Gives guys a place to hide or brings out the worst in them, whereas to also it traps the woman in and makes her feel like to be a good Christian, they have to stay. They have to endure.
Yeah.
Because what I've learned since leaving the faith is that divorce is a really good thing to have as an option. Like, the downside of not having a divorce is obviously you're trapped in the marriage. So no matter what they do to you, woman abused the guy, they can't leave. Guy abused the woman, they can't leave. They're trapped. It's a cage.
Yeah.
So because divorce is an option and now it's culturally acceptable, the cage has been opened. And so it makes people more able to leave horrible situations.
Well, yeah. And then on top of that, I think that it provides an outlet for, I think, a healthier marriage.
Right.
Where both people have the option of getting out.
Right.
And so the choosing to stay, the choosing to provide a place where the other would want to stay.
Right. It's different. It's a different feeling. Because before, it was a feeling of, he's not going to leave me because he loves Jesus. He's not going to want to dishonor Jesus. Now, it's, you're not going to leave me because you love me and you want to be with me.
Yeah.
And so that is different. And it feels much better. It feels more loving.
Well, the values shifted.
Right.
Instead of the value being in your relation to Jesus, now your value is you.
Right. And I don't remember who said it. Somebody said that exactly 0% of good, happy marriages end in divorce.
Yeah.
And that's true.
It's a profound thing to say.
Right. It's such a switch because divorce was a bad word in the faith. It was dirty. And now it's certainly something that I don't want and I don't think is going to happen to us.
But I don't see it as an awful thing.
It would be an awful thing if it happened to us. But in general, the concept of divorce isn't an awful thing. It's a way of people being able to be happy when they were in a bad situation.
Right. Well, you said there it would be horrible if it happened to us. But I don't think that the divorce is what would be horrible. What would be horrible is if our relationship deteriorated to the point where we felt like we needed to get a divorce.
That's the horrible part. That's true. Then at that point, the divorce is a relief. It's a good thing.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think that shift is
It's true.
What that quote you just said is getting at the heart of, is that the issue isn't divorce. The issue is toxic relationships.
Right.
Or
even just personalities that have been forced together that don't go together.
Turn into a toxic relationship.
Right.
Because it's not necessarily one person. It doesn't have to be one person who's being the toxic person or who is being abusive or anything like that.
It's just being torn down. Like, you can even see people two good people who are being broken and brought down because they're stuck, because they're trapped. And so it becomes toxic, even though neither person really on their own is toxic.
It used to be, if I met someone who was divorced, there was a bit of like a tarnish. So there was like some pity.
Yeah, that comes to the kind of the arrogant kind of position.
Right. Now, though, when I encounter someone who is divorced or who is going through divorce, especially who come from the kind of conservative culture that we come from, I have a lot of admiration for them, actually.
I have a lot of respect for all divorced people now. I mean, for the people who seem to get married and then divorced every other year, it's kind of weird.
That's a different
it's a niche thing.
Yeah, but people who have found the courage to get out of a relationship that was not beneficial and that was providing heartache and pain and whatever.
Yeah. Especially if they're Christian, because we know it's that much harder if you're in the faith to leave. So I just have so much respect for Christians who are divorced. Yeah. Because it's like, wow, you have the strength to leave a bad situation and carry on. And I think that's amazing.
Yeah. Despite whatever the culture around you is
despite
going
what
to
other people are saying.
You're going to do what you think is right for your situation.
Right. But that kind of lends into our third point, that there's a certain amount of arrogance that goes into having an evangelical fundamental view of marriage.
Well, we thought we had cornered the market on love.
Right. God is love. All love comes from God. Therefore, whether you know it or not, your love is from God. And if you're not in a Christian relationship, then you're not utilizing that love to its fullest potential, and you don't even understand it to its full potential.
Yeah. If you're not a Christian, if you don't know God, you can't really know love. And so whatever love you do have is limited.
Right.
And man, just so arrogant. That's such a...
It's a biblical view.
It is.
But it's insanely arrogant from this perspective, that we could think some of the things that we believed, like that marriage was between a man and a woman only. Because we used to believe that, because the woman represented the church and Jesus represented the man. So you can't have two men, because then you've got two Jesuses, and that's not reality.
Right.
You know, so it was just such
you can't have two churches, right? To go the other way.
The imagery is only allowed to go so far, right?
Right.
The woman can be the whole church and all the people, but you try to stick in another guy, then you can't use that imagery. You know, there's a line. But that's because we were fundamentalists, and there's a lot of, like we said, there's other denominations that don't believe that way. But within our sect, it had to be a man and a woman. Very specific view on what that was supposed to look like. To be a good, loving marriage in the way that God intended.
Right. And it's just amazing when I think back on how often I spoke on behalf of God.
Right.
I would read the Bible. I would interpret the Bible. And we've talked about this before, but you know, no matter how much somebody might say they're trying to let the Bible be their interpretive tool, let the Bible interpret the Bible, it's impossible to do that without it bringing your own preconceived ideas, bring your own background, all of that stuff into it. Right? So I'm interpreting the Bible and then saying, this is God's command. This is God's command. This is God's word. This is what God would say in this matter. And that's what we were doing with marriage and with love. We were pretending to be humble, thinking that we were humble.
Believing we were humble.
Not pretending. That's not the right word. Believing, deceiving ourselves into thinking that we were acting humbly because we were submitting to God's will. We were submitting to God's word and saying, this is what love is.
Right.
Not understanding the irony that we have to be the ones who were interpreting it.
Right.
And so it's what we wanted to say.
Right. And that it was humanity that penned it, translated it, and copied it, and changed it all the way through. So it's not even just an arrogance in yourself, it's an arrogance in humankind too. Right. That just solidifies, or that just really keeps this echo chamber of believing you know what's right for everybody. I have broken all of my wedding vows.
Yeah, so honestly, I was looking for my vows a bit. Since we moved, I can't figure out where I put them. And so I was wanting to actually go through them and actually talk about how we broke each of them. But we can remember some of them.
Right. It was something akin to, for me, that I would always seek to serve God first.
Yeah.
In our marriage.
I think we both had that in ours. That God would be first, that we would put Jesus first, because we believed that, this goes back to our definition of what love really was.
Right.
In order to properly love each other, we had to love Jesus first.
Right. If we wanted to serve each other well without animosity growing, with a smooth, good marriage, then we had to keep our eyes on Jesus and serve Jesus.
Right.
And then your spouse will be served in your marriage.
Yeah. And most certainly, we both broke that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, there had to come a point, when we were going through that deconversion process where that was tested and then it broke completely, right?
Yeah.
That kind of had to make the decision, okay, well, I can either decide to just stick it out and just focus on Jesus and knuckle down and only go after the Bible and only go after my understanding of Jesus. Or I can look at you and see the questions that you have that are unanswered and the problems that were sticking out and becoming more and more apparent, and I can dig into that and see what's going on there. And I had to make a decision. Right.
And I made a similar one, like on the vows, like, am I going to stick to a promise based on lies, based on untruths for the sake of following through with what I said I would do? Or am I going to adapt my life based on truth and to continue learning and aligning with reality?
Yeah.
And so I felt like the latter obviously was the right choice.
I know that I vowed to love you as Christ loved the church and to lead you.
Yeah.
And, well, I definitely failed at that, right? Stopped leading you into Christ and instead followed you out.
Yeah. I've been told by multiple people through the years that our wedding day was the most religious ceremony they had ever attended. And so for them to see us now was quite a trip.
We really did. We went all out on it. We did communion.
And we had Bible verses everywhere and like on the tables and stuff.
Over and over again, everything we would always point it back to loving Jesus and loving God.
That was the number one thing, show Jesus. So it's crazy to reflect back to all these ways that we used to believe and realize how twisted they are. And as like a secondary thought, it's crazy that I used to really feel like having a good marriage showed people Jesus. Like even that as a premise at all, like that somebody would look at our marriage and see, oh, she serves Kenny and Kenny serves her. They don't fight. They're happy. That's supposed to show Jesus.
Right.
Now I would see that as a good marriage, and that's great. But if I see a cult, if I see two people who believe Islam have a great marriage, I don't think, oh, Allah must be real. Or if I see two people in a cult who are very happy and very in love, I don't think, oh, that cult must be real. That must be the true faith. You know, it's not even a real evangelical tactic.
Yeah. Well, and I would say now we have plenty of married friends who either aren't Christian or are not anywhere near the type of Christian that we were.
Right. Just straight atheists or just the people who kind of dabble in religion here and there but don't really go to church that we would have called unbelievers before.
Right. In our arrogance.
Yeah, in our arrogance.
But I would say that their marriages are
excellent,
just as healthy or more healthy than many Christian marriages that I've seen.
Right. Just mutual respect,
a lot more
communication, honesty. Yes. Just disagree publicly, but kindly. Just like we said. And I've been asked by a couple friends since leaving the faith, like how marriage is going, because they knew that our marriage was based on Christ.
What did you say?
I said it was great. The marriage is better than ever, but I think that it would have been great before too. I mean, we had a great marriage before too. It's every year that we're together, we get to know each other more, and like the commitment just keeps getting deeper and deeper. So I think that probably would have been true even if we were still in the faith.
I think we've always had pretty open lines of communication.
And that's the ticket though, is I don't think it ever had anything to do with God, even though we thought that it did. I think it more had to do with open lines of communication and mutual respect. Yeah. I think that's
and similar interests.
And obviously we loved each other. Yeah, similar interests and then love for each other, like that drew us together in the first place. And then finding out too after that, after seeing all of these really good marriages outside of the faith, just one after the other, then finding out that the divorce rates among atheists is lower than among Christians. Like, oh, that makes sense actually if you think about it. With all of the hidden abuse, the misogyny, the feeling trapped, this pressure to keep things to yourself.
And I think there's a pressure to get married in at least in the evangelical Christian culture.
Get married, make babies. That's a little bit your job as the woman.
Well, no, I mean
and even as the guy.
As a person.
Like, as a person.
That's part of the divine. In fact, I had one pastor who told me once that if in your marriage, if you don't intend to have children, you're in sin.
Yeah.
If you don't intend to have children, you're in sin.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Which, that reflects a Catholic idea as well, right?
Go forth and multiply, like...
Right, that's part of the divine mandate from the beginning. You're supposed to multiply, you're supposed to reproduce, because you're supposed to be reproducing the image of God.
I mean, certainly people get married, statistically, in the church much younger than among atheists, and make more babies.
Yeah.
And within the atheist community, agnostic community, or just apart from the evangelical faith, you have people waiting longer, getting married for different reasons. They get married because they want to be together forever. They love each other, not because they're trying to serve a divine entity.
Right.
It's very interesting how things have shifted. I wonder if we have any questions for our viewers that might feel the same or differently about marriage.
Yeah. Do you think that the biblical depiction of marriage and the roles of men and women is inherently misogynistic? And if not, how do you justify that? Or what are your thoughts on the way we portrayed the biblical view of marriage? Misogynistic, men have the power, women are submissive situation. Do you think that accurately represents what the Bible is saying? Or do you think that we're way off? And what do you do with those verses that most certainly depict women as the weaker vessel, like in 1 Peter, or women remaining silent or not preaching, not speaking over men, as Paul writes in a couple of different places, or any of the Old Testament examples of men being more valued than women?
Do you think that it requires a specific belief set to have a good marriage, or can anyone of any faith have an equally good marriage?
What are your views on divorce? Is it something that is awful and to be avoided, like we used to believe in our evangelical Christianity, or can you see it as something that is a good remedy for a bad relationship, for a bad marriage?
So a review of our questions?
Do you think we accurately depicted the biblical perspective on marriage as being misogynistic? If not, explain.
Do you think it requires a specific faith to have a good marriage, or can a person have an equally good marriage, irregardless of the type of belief system that they hold to?
And what are your views on divorce? Is it something to be avoided, or is it a good remedy for a bad situation? Thanks for listening to Questioning Faith.
We hope you guys enjoyed it.
If you have any thoughts or questions, you can reach us at KennyandMonicaAskQuestions@gmail.com.
You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter.
Our next episode will be available on March 24th. But until then, remember,
always ask questions.